A black woman named Martha is accused of being a thief by a racist clerk at a department store, but it turns out he doesn't know who she really is. This explosive encounter will either spark a dramatic transformation, or it will end in bitter regret. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Martha Lawson stepped into the busy department store, her heart light with anticipation. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the warm summer day outside. She smiled, thinking of her sister's upcoming graduation and the perfect gift she hoped to find. "Okay, let's do this," Martha whispered to herself, her eyes scanning the colorful signs hanging from the ceiling. She spotted the one that read electronics and headed in that direction. The store buzzed with activity. Families pushed carts filled with clothes and toys. Couples held hands as they browsed kitchen appliances. And there, in the back corner, Martha found what she was looking for, a sea of shiny screens and sleek devices. She approached the tablet display, her eyes widening at the choices. There were so many, big ones, small ones, some with keyboards, others with styluses. Martha picked up a slim silver model, turning it over in her hands. "This might be perfect," she murmured, imagining her sister's face lighting up when she opened it. As Martha explored the different features, she felt a sense of pride. She remembered when she could barely afford a simple flip phone. Now, as a successful tech entrepreneur, she could give her sister a top-of-the-line tablet. It felt good to be able to do that. She moved from one display to another, comparing prices and specs. The excitement of finding the right gift bubbled up inside her. Martha loved giving presents, especially when they were meaningful like this one. "I wonder if she'd prefer the blue or the rose gold," Martha mused aloud, holding up two different models. She was so focused on the tablets that she didn't notice the looks some other shoppers were giving her. Martha was lost in thought, imagining her sister using the tablet for school projects or video chatting with her from college. As she reached for another model on a high shelf, Martha felt someone brush past her roughly. She stumbled a bit but caught herself. "Oh, excuse me," she said politely, even though the other person hadn't apologized. Martha straightened her shirt and returned her attention to the tablets. She was determined to find the perfect one, unaware that her shopping experience was about to take an unexpected turn. As Martha continued to browse the tablets, a middle-aged man in a crisp white store uniform approached the electronics section. This was George Thompson, a longtime employee of the department store. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, a habit he'd developed over years of dealing with all sorts of customers. George's gaze landed on Martha and his brow furrowed. He watched as she picked up one of the most expensive tablets, turning it over in her hands. "Humph," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head slightly. He'd seen her type before, or so he thought. Young, casually dressed, probably just window shopping or worse, he assumed. George's mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusions. He couldn't help but think she might be planning to steal something. "Better keep an eye on this one," George mumbled to himself, his lips pressed into a thin line. He pretended to straighten some nearby displays, all the while keeping Martha in his peripheral vision. Every time she picked up a new device, George's suspicion grew. He watched as she compared different models, his face growing more pinched with each passing moment. When Martha reached for a high-end laptop, George couldn't contain himself any longer. He began to follow her, maintaining what he thought was a discreet distance. He moved from aisle to aisle, always a few steps behind Martha. As she examined a smartwatch, George hovered nearby, pretending to organize a stack of computer mice. His eyes never left her hands, watching for any sign of theft. The more gadgets Martha looked at, the more convinced George became that she was up to no good. "She can't possibly afford any of this," George thought to himself, his prejudice clouding his judgment. He failed to notice the genuine interest in Martha's eyes, or the careful way she compared features between devices. Instead, all George saw was a potential threat to the store's merchandise. His years of dealing with shoplifters and difficult customers had left him jaded, quick to judge based on appearances alone. And in his eyes, Martha fit the profile he'd created in his mind. As Martha continued to browse, George's doubts intensified with each passing moment. He watched her pick up a top-of-the-line tablet, his eyes narrowing as she carefully read the specifications displayed on the small card next to it. Why would someone like her be interested in such an expensive item? George thought to himself, his lips pressed into a thin line. He shook his head slightly, unable to shake off his growing suspicion. In his mind, George began to paint a picture of Martha that was far from the truth. She's probably just window shopping, he reasoned internally. There's no way she can afford something like that. As Martha moved to examine another high-end device, George's internal monologue continued, revealing his deep-seated biases. I am so sure. I've seen her type before, he mused bitterly. They come in here pretending to be interested customers, but they're really just looking for an opportunity to steal. George's focus on Martha intensified. He noted every move she made, his suspicion growing with each item she touched. When she pulled out her phone to compare prices, George's heart rate quickened. Uh-huh, he thought. She's probably texting now an accomplice. He moved closer, pretending to straighten a nearby display. From this vantage point, he could see Martha's face more clearly. She wore an expression of genuine interest and concentration, but George's prejudiced mind twisted this into something sinister. Look at her, acting all innocent, he grumbled to himself. But I know better. She's planning something, I'm sure of it. As Martha reached for another tablet, this one even more expensive than the last, George felt his suspicions solidify into certainty. In his mind, there was no innocent explanation for her actions. He couldn't fathom that she might actually be a successful businesswoman looking for a thoughtful gift. Instead, George's biases led him to one conclusion. Martha must be up to no good. He watched her like a hawk, waiting for any sign of wrongdoing, completely blind to the reality of the situation. George's suspicion reached a fever pitch as Martha moved gracefully to the accessories section. His eyes narrowed, watching her every move like a hawk stalking its prey. She picked up a sleek, high-end case, turning it over in her hands with care and admiration. Just as I thought, George muttered under his breath, his lips curling into a sneer. She's going for the whole set. No way she can afford all this. Martha's fingers then brushed against a pair of wireless headphones, the latest model with noise-canceling features. She examined them closely, a small smile playing on her lips as she imagined her sister's delight at receiving such a thoughtful gift. But to George, her smile looked devious and calculating. His mind raced with unfounded suspicions. She's either planning to walk out with those items or try to pull a fast one at the register, he thought, his face flushing with anger and self-righteousness. Unable to contain himself any longer, George abandoned all pretense of going about his regular duties. He began to follow Martha more closely, his footsteps echoing in the quiet aisle. Grabbing random items off the shelves, he pretended to be arranging them, all while keeping his gaze fixed firmly on Martha. I'll catch her in the act, he promised himself, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a mismatched item on the wrong shelf. She won't get away with it. Not on my watch. Martha, absorbed in her shopping, initially failed to notice George's hovering presence. But as she moved down the aisle, a prickle of unease ran down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, catching sight of George, quickly averting his gaze. That's odd, Martha thought to herself, her brow furrowing slightly. But being the kind-hearted person she was, she quickly dismissed the notion. He's probably just doing his job, no need to be paranoid. With a small shrug, Martha returned her attention to the items in her hands, unaware of the storm brewing behind George's eyes. She had no idea that his misplaced suspicion was about to turn her simple shopping trip into something far more complicated. George's eyes narrowed as he watched Martha compare different tablets. She held one in each hand, carefully reading the specifications on their boxes. To George, this innocent act of comparison shopping looked like a calculated ploy. She's trying to figure out which one's easiest to snatch, he thought, his jaw clenching. Martha moved on to examine a high-end smartwatch, her fingers gently tracing its sleek edges. She glanced around the store, looking for a sales associate to ask about its features. But to George, her casual survey of the area seemed sinister. Checking to see if anyone's watching her, he mumbled, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. As Martha continued her shopping, George's imagination ran wild. He pictured her slipping a tablet into her purse when no one was looking. In his mind's eye, he saw her casually walking towards the exit, expensive items hidden away. "Not on my watch," George whispered, his hands balling into fists. Martha's careful consideration of each item only fueled George's paranoia. When she spent several minutes reading the back of a box, George convinced himself she was memorizing the security tag placement. "She's planning how to remove it," he thought, his face flushing with anger. Every innocent action Martha took, George twisted in his mind. When she checked her phone, he assumed she was signaling an accomplice. Her polite smile at a passing customer looked to him like a devious smirk. George's heart raced as he imagined Martha making a break for the door. He could almost see her sprinting through the store, arms full of stolen merchandise. In his mind, he heroically tackled her, saving the day and earning praise from his bosses. The reality, of course, was far different. Martha was simply a considerate shopper, wanting to make the best choice for her sister's gift. But in George's paranoid state, every move she made seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. George's heart pounded as he watched Martha approach the checkout counter. His eyes narrowed, focused on her every move. In his mind, he was certain she was about to attempt something illegal. "This is it," he thought, his palms sweaty. "She's gonna try to pull a fast one." Just as Martha was about to reach the checkout, George stepped forward, his face tight with suspicion. He planted himself directly in her path, causing her to stop abruptly. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I couldn't help but notice you've selected some rather expensive items. Are you sure you can afford these?" Martha's eyes widened in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Nearby customers paused, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. Whispers began to circulate as George continued his confrontation. "I've been watching you," George pressed on, his tone growing more aggressive. "You've been acting suspiciously. I think you're planning to steal these items, or maybe use some kind of fake credit card." Martha found her voice at last. "What? That's ridiculous. I haven't done anything wrong." But George wasn't backing down. He pointed at her purse, his eyes narrowed. "Open your bag. I want to see what else you've taken from the store." Martha clutched her purse tighter, anger and hurt bubbling up inside her. "Absolutely not. You have no right to accuse me like this." The confrontation was drawing more attention now. Other customers and staff members were gathering around, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The atmosphere in the store grew tense, like a rubber band stretched to its limit. George, feeling emboldened by the audience, raised his voice. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have a problem opening your bag." Martha stood her ground, her voice shaking with emotion. "I will not. This is harassment." George's face reddened with frustration. He turned to a nearby staff member and barked, "Call security! We've got a thief here." The accusation echoed through the store, leaving Martha stunned and humiliated as curious onlookers watched the scene unfold. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "What on earth is going on here?" The crowd parted, revealing Mr. Davis, the store's owner. His presence was like a sudden gust of wind, scattering the tension in the air. He strode forward, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on Martha and George. "Someone explain this to me right now," Mr. Davis demanded, his voice firm but controlled. George stepped forward, his chest puffed out with misplaced confidence. "Sir, I caught this woman acting suspiciously. I believe she was planning to steal—" "Martha?" Mr. Davis interrupted, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "Martha Lawson?" Martha nodded, her composure intact despite the ordeal. "Hello, Mr. Davis. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Mr. Davis turned to George, his expression hardening. "George, do you have any idea who this woman is?" George faltered, his confidence evaporating under Mr. Davis's stern gaze. I assumed." "You assumed wrong," Mr. Davis said sharply. He addressed the gathered crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Martha Lawson. She's not only a highly successful tech entrepreneur, but also our store's largest investor." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Whispers of shock and disbelief filled the air as the gravity of the situation sank in. George's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Mr. Davis placed a gentle hand on Martha's shoulder. "Ms. Lawson, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this incident. Please, let's go to my office to discuss this further." Martha nodded, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around her. But as she looked at Mr. Davis, the hurt and disappointment in her eyes were unmistakable. The pain of being judged so harshly based on her appearance was etched across her face. As Mr. Davis led Martha away, the crowd began to disperse, leaving George standing alone, the weight of his actions crushing down on him. Mr. Davis led Martha into his office, closing the door behind them. The sudden quiet was a stark contrast to the commotion they'd just left behind. He gestured for her to take a seat in a plush leather chair across from his desk. "Ms. Lawson, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what just happened," Mr. Davis began, his voice heavy with regret. "This is not how we treat any customer, let alone someone who has been so supportive of our store." Martha sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap. Her calm exterior belied the turmoil of emotions churning inside her. "Mr. Davis, I've always believed in this store. I've invested not just my money, but my trust in you and your team. To be treated like a criminal, it's more than disappointing. It's heartbreaking." Mr. Davis nodded solemnly. "I understand. George will be dealt with accordingly, I assure you." Martha shook her head, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "While I appreciate that, Mr. Davis, I'm more concerned about the bigger picture. This isn't just about one employee's actions. It's about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed." She leaned forward, her voice passionate but controlled. "What happened to me today? It happens to people who look like me every day. People who don't have the protection of being a major investor. People who are just trying to live their lives, shop for their families without being judged or harassed." Mr. Davis listened intently, his brow furrowed with concern. "What we need," Martha continued, "is better training for your staff. We need to raise awareness about unconscious biases and how they affect customer interactions. This incident highlights a gap in your employees' understanding and approach to diversity." She paused, her eyes meeting Mr. Davis's. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt today. Not in this store, not anywhere." Mr. Davis listened intently to Martha's words, his expression a mixture of shame and determination. He nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Lawson," he said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "We need to do better, much better. What would you suggest as our next steps?" Martha took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. Despite the hurt she felt, she knew this was an opportunity for real change. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting Mr. Davis's with unwavering resolve. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I don't want to pull my investment from the store. That won't solve anything. Instead, I have a proposition." Mr. Davis raised an eyebrow, curious about what she had in mind. "George," Martha continued, "he made a terrible mistake today, but firing him won't address the root of the problem. I propose we give him a chance to learn and grow from this experience." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I suggest that George keeps his job, but on one condition: he must undergo extensive training on diversity and inclusion. And not just a one-day seminar, I'm talking about a comprehensive program that really digs deep into these issues." Mr. Davis nodded, impressed by Martha's compassionate approach. "Additionally," Martha added, "I think it would be beneficial for George to volunteer at the local foundation that supports communities facing racism. It's called Unity Bridge. This hands-on experience could be eye-opening for him." Just then, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Mr. Davis called for the person to enter, and George stepped into the office, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. "George," Mr. Davis said, his tone stern but not unkind, "Ms. Lawson has a proposition for you." Martha turned to face George, her expression serious but not angry. She explained her proposal, watching as George's expression shifted from fear to surprise, and finally to a mix of relief and trepidation. "It's your choice, George," Martha concluded. "This is your chance to learn, to grow, and to make things right. Are you willing to take it?" George swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Martha and Mr. Davis. He knew this was his only chance at redemption, his opportunity to keep his job and, more importantly, to become a better person. The next day, George sat in the back of the training room, arms crossed and a scowl on his face. He couldn't believe he had to waste his time on this diversity and inclusion nonsense. The trainer, a cheerful woman named Sarah, stood at the front of the room, her smile unwavering as she faced the group of employees. "Today we're going to explore our unconscious biases," Sarah began, her voice warm and inviting. George rolled his eyes. "What a load of rubbish," he muttered under his breath. As the session progressed, Sarah presented various scenarios and asked the group to discuss their initial reactions. George remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. But as his co-workers shared their thoughts, he found himself listening despite his best efforts not to. "I never realized I made those assumptions," one of his colleagues admitted, looking sheepish. George's frown deepened. He didn't want to admit it, but some of the examples hit close to home. He thought back to the incident with Martha, his stomach churning with an uncomfortable mix of shame and defensiveness. During a break, George found himself alone by the water cooler. Sarah approached him, her smile gentle and non-judgmental. "How are you finding the session, George?" she asked. He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It's interesting, I guess." Sarah nodded, sensing his reluctance. "It can be tough to confront these issues. But remember, we're all here to learn and grow." As the training continued, George found his resistance slowly crumbling. He began to see patterns in his own behavior that he'd never noticed before. The way he'd jump to conclusions based on appearances, the snap judgments he'd make without even realizing it. During a group exercise, George hesitantly shared a story from his past. I once refused to help a customer because I thought they couldn't afford anything in the store," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong, and I lost a big sale that day." The room fell silent, and George felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he was beginning to understand the impact of his actions. He thought about Martha and how she must have felt, being accused and humiliated for no reason. As the session came to a close, George approached Sarah. I think I need to learn more," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Do you have any recommendations for books or resources?" Sarah's face lit up. "Absolutely, George, I'd be happy to share some with you." A few more days, Martha stepped out of her car, taking in the cheerful exterior of the community center. The building was painted in bright, welcoming colors, and a mural of diverse hands joining together adorned one wall. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. As she entered the bustling lobby, Martha was struck by the warmth and energy of the place. People of all ages and backgrounds milled about, chatting and laughing. The air buzzed with a sense of purpose and community. "Ms. Lawson?" a friendly voice called out. Martha turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching with an outstretched hand. "I'm Linda Carter, the Foundation's director. It's wonderful to meet you." Martha smiled, shaking Linda's hand. "Thank you for having me, Ms. Carter. This place is amazing." Linda beamed with pride. "We try our best. Shall we talk in my office?" As they settled into Linda's cozy office, Martha took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I'm here about George Thompson," she began, her voice soft but firm. "He's going to be volunteering here as part of a learning experience." Linda nodded, her expression understanding. "Yes, I received the email about his situation. It's a delicate matter." Martha leaned forward, her eyes earnest. "I believe in second chances, Ms. Carter. What George did was wrong, but I hope that by being here, by seeing the incredible work you do, he might change." Linda listened intently, her fingers laced together on her desk. "We've had volunteers like George before," she said thoughtfully. It's not always easy, but we've seen some remarkable transformations. That's what I'm hoping for, Martha replied, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. I want him to understand the harm his actions can cause, but also to see the beauty in our differences. The next day, George stood nervously at the entrance of the community center. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and his eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The bright colors and cheerful atmosphere felt at odds with his gloomy mood. As he pushed open the door, a wave of chatter and laughter washed over him. George felt his chest tighten. He'd never been in a place quite like this before. "You must be George," a kind voice said. He turned to see Linda Carter smiling at him. "Welcome to our foundation. We're glad to have you here." George mumbled a quiet, "Thanks," his discomfort evident in every line of his body. Linda led him through the bustling main area. People of all ages and backgrounds were engaged in various activities. Some were painting, others were huddled over computers, and a group in the corner was having an animated discussion. "We have a lot of different programs here," Linda explained. "Today we'd like you to help out in our after-school tutoring program." George's eyes widened. I'm not sure I'm qualified for that," he stammered. Linda's smile was patient. "Don't worry, you'll be assisting our regular tutors. It's more about being there for the kids, showing them someone cares." As they approached the tutoring area, George could feel curious eyes on him. The staff had been briefed about his situation, and while they were polite, there was a wariness in their gazes that made him squirm. A young tutor named Mike approached them. "Hi there," he said, extending his hand to George. "I hear you'll be working with us today." George shook his hand hesitantly. "Yeah, I guess so," he replied, his voice gruff with nervousness. Mike nodded, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Well, let's get you started. We have a group of middle schoolers coming in soon for math help." As George followed Mike to a table, he couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. The colorful posters on the walls, the excited chatter of arriving kids, the easy camaraderie among the other volunteers. It all felt so foreign to him. Over the next few weeks, George found himself returning to the foundation, each visit a little less daunting than the last. The bright colors that had once seemed garish now felt welcoming, and the constant buzz of activity no longer set his nerves on edge. One afternoon, Linda approached him with a hopeful smile. "George, we're starting a new youth mentorship program. Would you be interested in helping out?" George hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I'm not sure I'd be any good at that," he admitted. Linda's eyes sparkled with encouragement. "You might surprise yourself. Just give it a try?" Reluctantly, George agreed. The following week, he found himself sitting across from Jamal, a high school sophomore with a quick wit and an infectious laugh. As they talked, Jamal opened up about his experiences. "You know, sometimes people look at me funny when I walk into a store," he said, his voice growing quiet. "Like they think I'm going to steal something." George felt a pang in his chest, remembering his own actions towards Martha. He listened intently as Jamal continued. "It hurts, you know? Being judged before anyone even knows you." Over the weeks, George met more young people like Jamal. There was Maria, whose family faced constant suspicion because of their accent, and Tyler, who was followed around stores just for wearing a hoodie. Each story chipped away at George's old beliefs. He began to see the world through their eyes, understanding the pain and frustration they faced daily. It wasn't just about one incident in a store anymore. It was about a lifetime of small cuts that never seemed to heal. One day, as he was leaving the foundation, George paused to look at a mural on the wall. It showed a diverse group of people, hands joined, faces filled with hope. For the first time, he didn't see stereotypes or threats. He saw people, individuals with dreams, fears, and the simple desire to be treated with respect. George's heart felt heavy, but in a new way. It wasn't the weight of fear or suspicion anymore. It was the weight of understanding, of realizing the impact his actions and beliefs had on others. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. The following days, one afternoon, Martha stepped into the bustling community center, her eyes scanning the colorful room. The air was filled with laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere of their last encounter. She had come to check on George's progress, curious to see if the man who had judged her so harshly was truly capable of change. As she moved through the space, Martha caught sight of George sitting at a table with a group of teenagers. She paused, choosing to observe from a distance. The George she saw now was almost unrecognizable from the bitter store clerk she had met weeks ago. He leaned in, listening intently as a young girl with braids spoke animatedly. His face, once creased with suspicion, now showed genuine interest. When the girl finished speaking, George nodded thoughtfully before responding. Martha couldn't hear his words, but she saw the girl's face light up with a smile. As she watched, George moved from group to group. He helped a boy with his math homework, his patience evident as he explained the problem step by step. Later, he joined a group discussing their experiences with discrimination. Instead of dismissing their stories or becoming defensive, George listened with a furrowed brow, asking questions that showed he was truly trying to understand. What struck Martha most was the change in George's body language. Gone was the tense, guarded posture she remembered. Now, his shoulders were relaxed, his gestures open and welcoming. He made eye contact with everyone he spoke to, regardless of their age or background. At one point, a young man accidentally bumped into George, nearly spilling his drink. Martha tensed, half expecting to see a flash of the old George. But to her surprise, George simply steadied the boy with a gentle hand and a kind smile. As the session wound down, Martha watched George say goodbye to the teens. There was a warmth in his interactions that she never would have believed possible just a few weeks ago. It wasn't a complete transformation. She could still see moments of hesitation, fleeting instances where old habits threatened to resurface. But the change was undeniable. On that day, as George prepared to leave the community center, a small figure caught his eye. A young boy, no more than 12, sat alone in the corner, his shoulders hunched and his eyes downcast. Something about the boy's demeanor struck a chord with George, and he found himself walking over. "Mind if I sit here?" George asked softly. The boy shrugged, not looking up. George settled into the chair next to him. "I'm George. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy mumbled. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. Are you okay? You seem a bit down." Ethan hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "Some kids at school? They make fun of me. They say I look poor and that I don't belong there." George felt a jolt of recognition. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories of his own childhood flooded back. The taunts, the judgmental looks, the feeling of being an outsider. "I'm sorry, Ethan, that must be really tough," George said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, finally looking up at George. "It's not fair. They don't even know me. They just look at my clothes and decide I'm not good enough." George's heart clenched. He saw himself in Ethan's eyes, the hurt, the confusion, the anger at being judged unfairly. But he also saw something else. The person he had become, the man who had done the same thing to Martha. "You're right, Ethan, it's not fair at all," George said, his voice cracking. "And you know what? Those kids are wrong. You are good enough. You belong anywhere you want to be." Ethan's eyes widened, hope flickering in their depths. "Really?" "Really," George affirmed. "I know it's hard to believe sometimes, but trust me. I've been on both sides of this, and I can tell you, judging someone based on how they look or what they wear, it's always wrong." As the words left his mouth, George felt something shift inside him. The full weight of his actions towards Martha hit him, and he felt a wave of shame and regret wash over him. As the weeks passed, George's experiences at the community center began to seep into his daily life at the store. The change was subtle at first, but soon became impossible to ignore. One busy afternoon, a customer approached George with a question about a product. In the past, George might have brushed them off or given a curt response. But this time, he paused, took a deep breath, and really listened. "I'm not sure about that model," George said thoughtfully, "but let me show you a few options that might work for you." The customer beamed, grateful for George's patience and attention. As they walked away with their purchase, George felt a warm glow of satisfaction. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. His co-workers started to notice the change too. Sarah, a newer employee, had always been intimidated by George's gruff demeanor. But when she made a mistake at the register, George surprised her with his response. "Don't worry about it," he said gently. "We all make mistakes. Here, let me show you how to fix it." Sarah's relief was palpable. "Thanks, George," she said with a shy smile. "I really appreciate your help." As the days went by, more and more customers sought out George for assistance. His newfound patience and willingness to listen made him a favorite among shoppers. Even difficult customers, who might have set him off in the past, were met with calm understanding. George's manager, Mr. Ramirez, couldn't help but notice the positive shift. During a staff meeting, he pulled George aside. "I have to say, George, I'm impressed," Mr. Ramirez said. "Your customer service has improved dramatically. What's changed?" George thought for a moment, then replied, "I guess I've learned to see people differently. Everyone has a story, you know. And it's not our job to judge, just to help." Mr. Ramirez nodded approvingly. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. You're setting a great example for the team." As George walked back to his station, he caught sight of his reflection in a store mirror. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, softer, more open. He realized that the change he'd been experiencing wasn't just on the outside. Something fundamental had shifted within him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt proud of the person he was becoming. On a crisp autumn morning, Martha stepped into the department store, her eyes scanning the familiar aisles. She was on a mission to find a birthday gift for her mother, and the store's wide selection made it the perfect place to start her search. Along her way to the department store, she saw George from afar on the store. George was arranging a display of tech gadgets, his movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, Martha hesitated, memories of their last encounter flooding back. But she noticed something different about George, a calmness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. George looked up and immediately recognized Martha. His eyes widened, and a mix of emotions crossed his face: surprise, shame, and then a flicker of hope. He set down the headphones he was wiping and approached her slowly, his posture humble. "Ms. Lawson," he said softly, I'm so glad to see you." Martha offered a small smile, curious about what he would say next. George took a deep breath and continued, his voice filled with sincerity. "I wanted to thank you. What you did for me, giving me a chance to learn and grow, it's changed my life. I know I can never fully make up for how I treated you, but I want you to know that I'm truly grateful for the opportunity you gave me." Martha listened carefully, noting the genuine remorse in George's words. She could see the change in him. It was evident in his body language, his tone, and the look in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that, George," Martha replied warmly. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong and to make an effort to change. I'm pleased to see the progress you've made." George nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. "I'm trying my best. The training and the work at the foundation, it's opened my eyes to so much. I see things differently now, and I'm working hard to be better every day." Martha smiled, but her expression turned serious as she continued. "That's wonderful, George. But remember, this is just the beginning. Unlearning prejudice and becoming truly inclusive is a lifelong journey. There will be challenges and setbacks, but what matters is that you keep learning and growing." Mr. Davis approached Martha and George, his face beaming with pride. He had been watching their interaction from afar, and the change in George was evident even to him. "George, Martha," he greeted them warmly. "It's wonderful to see you both here." Mr. Davis turned to George, his eyes twinkling with approval. "George, I must say, I've been incredibly impressed with your progress. The effort you've put into your training and volunteer work has not gone unnoticed." George's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and pride. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. I've learned so much, and I'm grateful for the chance to do better." Mr. Davis nodded, then addressed both of them. "You know, this experience has been eye-opening for all of us. We've made some big changes in the store because of it." Martha raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what kind of changes?" Mr. Davis smiled. "Well, for starters, we've implemented mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all our staff. Everyone, from our newest hires to our most senior employees, has gone through it." George chimed in, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "It's been amazing, Ms. Lawson. The training has really helped us understand each other better and serve our customers more effectively." Mr. Davis continued, "We've also revised our policies to ensure they're fair and inclusive, and we've set up a system for customers to provide feedback on their experiences in the store." Martha looked around, noticing subtle changes in the store's atmosphere. The staff seemed more engaged with customers regardless of their appearance or background. There was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. "I can feel the difference," Martha said softly. "It's more welcoming now." Mr. Davis nodded, his expression serious. "That's exactly what we've been aiming for. We want everyone who walks through our doors to feel valued and respected." As they spoke, a customer approached them, a middle-aged woman with a bright smile. "Excuse me," she said. "I just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed shopping here lately. There's been such a positive change in the atmosphere. It feels like everyone is truly welcome." George's transformation continued to unfold, both at the store and at the foundation. Each day, he found himself looking at the world with new eyes, noticing things he had once overlooked or dismissed. The change wasn't just in his actions, but in his very way of thinking. At the store, George became a vocal advocate for inclusive practices. He started suggesting ideas to Mr. Davis about how they could make the shopping experience even better for all customers. One day, he approached his boss with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Davis," George began, his voice filled with enthusiasm, "I was thinking, what if we created a more diverse display in our front windows? We could showcase products that appeal to different cultures and communities." Mr. Davis listened intently, nodding his approval. "That's an excellent idea, George. Why don't you take charge of that project?" George's face lit up with excitement. He threw himself into the task, carefully selecting items that represented a wide range of customers. When the new display was unveiled, he felt a surge of pride as he watched people of all backgrounds stop to admire it. At the foundation, George's commitment deepened. He found himself looking forward to his volunteer shifts, eager to connect with the people he met there. The young boy who had reminded him of his younger self became a regular mentee, and George delighted in watching the child's confidence grow. One afternoon, as George was helping with a community outreach event, he overheard two elderly ladies talking. "You know," one said to the other, "I never thought I'd see the day when that grumpy store clerk would be out here, helping folks like us." George felt a pang of shame at the memory of his past behavior, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of determination. He approached the ladies with a warm smile. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I know I wasn't always the most welcoming person, but I'm learning and trying to do better. Is there anything I can help you with today?" The ladies looked at him in surprise, then smiled back. "Well, aren't you a changed man?" one of them chuckled. "We could use some help setting up these tables for the bake sale." As George worked alongside them, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than just a job or an obligation. It was a calling. He realized that he had found a purpose he had never known before, one that filled him with a sense of joy and fulfillment. The store buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life gathered for the community event. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, proclaiming, "Celebrating unity and understanding." The aisles had been cleared to make room for chairs, creating an impromptu auditorium in the heart of the store. George stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a warm smile. He couldn't help but marvel at the diversity of the crowd, young and old, representing various ethnicities and backgrounds. It was a stark contrast to the store atmosphere just a few months ago. Mr. Davis took the stage, his face beaming with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the store, "thank you all for coming today. We're here to celebrate the positive changes we've made in our community and to honor someone who made it all possible." He gestured towards Martha, who sat in the front row. "Please welcome our guest of honor, Ms. Martha Lawson." The crowd erupted in applause as Martha gracefully made her way to the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you all for being here today," Martha began, her voice strong and clear. "A few months ago, I walked into this store and faced a situation that, sadly, many people of color experience far too often. But instead of anger, I chose hope. I chose to believe that change was possible." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Today, I see that change. I see a community coming together, learning from each other, and growing stronger because of our differences, not in spite of them." Martha's words resonated through the store, touching hearts and minds. She spoke of the importance of inclusion, of how understanding and empathy could bridge even the widest divides. But most importantly, she emphasized the power of second chances. "We all make mistakes," she continued, her voice softening. "What matters is how we learn from them and what we do to make things right. This store, and everyone in it, has shown that transformation is possible when we open our hearts and minds." As Martha spoke, George felt a lump form in his throat. He caught her eye and she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, he felt the full weight of his journey, from prejudice to understanding, from ignorance to growth. The crowd hung on Martha's every word, nodding in agreement and occasionally breaking into applause. There was a palpable sense of unity in the air, a feeling that something special was happening in this community. As Martha finished her speech, Mr. Davis returned to the podium. His eyes scanned the crowd before settling on George. "We have one more speaker today," he announced. "Someone who has shown us that real change is possible. George, would you please come up and share your story?" A hush fell over the audience as George slowly made his way to the front. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced. He had never spoken in front of so many people before. As he reached the podium, he took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces. I never thought I'd be standing here," George began, his voice shaky. "A few months ago, I was a different person. I was quick to judge, full of prejudice and blind to my own biases." He paused, swallowing hard. "I made a terrible mistake. I accused Martha, a successful businesswoman and our biggest investor, of theft simply because of how she looked. I was wrong, so very wrong." George's eyes welled up with tears as he continued. "But instead of firing me, Martha gave me a chance to learn and grow. She sent me to diversity training and had me volunteer at a local foundation. At first, I was resentful. But then, something changed." His voice grew stronger as he recounted his experiences at the foundation. "I met people from all walks of life. I heard their stories, saw their struggles, and for the first time, I truly listened. I realized how much damage my prejudices had caused, not just to others, but to myself." George looked directly at Martha, his eyes filled with gratitude. Martha's kindness and forgiveness opened my eyes. It made me want to be better, to do better. Now I'm committed to being an advocate for change, both here at the store and in our community. As George finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved by his honesty and vulnerability. George felt overwhelmed by the support, a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt before. As the event wound down, Martha and George found themselves in a quiet corner of the store. The bustling crowd had thinned, leaving them a moment of privacy. George fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting around before finally settling on Martha's face. "Martha," he began, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "I don't even know where to start. Thank you just doesn't seem enough." Martha smiled gently, encouraging him to continue. George took a deep breath and pressed on. "What you did for me, giving me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. It changed my life. I was so wrong, so blind. Your forgiveness and guidance opened my eyes to a world I never knew existed." Tears welled up in George's eyes as he spoke. "I'm so sorry for how I treated you that day. I can't take it back, but I promise you, I'm working every day to be better." Martha reached out and placed a comforting hand on George's arm. "George, I see the work you've been doing. It hasn't gone unnoticed. Your speech today showed just how far you've come." George nodded, wiping away a tear. It's been hard facing my own prejudices, but every day at the foundation, every training session, it's like I'm peeling back layers of ignorance. I never realized how much I didn't know, how much I assumed. Martha's eyes shone with understanding. That's the thing about this journey, George. It's ongoing. We're all learning and growing every day. What matters is that you're committed to it now. I am, George said firmly. I want to keep learning, keep growing. I want to help others see what I've seen. Martha smiled warmly. That's all anyone can ask for. We're all works in progress, George. The important thing is that we keep moving forward. Keep trying to understand each other better. George nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. I'm optimistic about the future, Martha. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself. That's the beauty of empathy and understanding, Martha replied. It connects us all. We're in this together, George. And together, we can make a real difference. In the weeks following the community event, the foundation where George volunteered saw a surge of interest and support. The heartfelt speeches and the story of transformation had struck a chord with many in the community. People from all walks of life began reaching out, eager to get involved and make a difference. George watched in amazement as the foundation's small office became a hub of activity. New faces appeared daily, each person bringing their own unique skills and experiences to the table. The foundation's director, Sarah, could barely contain her excitement as she worked tirelessly to channel this newfound energy into meaningful action. George, Sarah called out one busy afternoon, can you help show these new volunteers around? They're interested in our youth mentorship program. George nodded, feeling a sense of pride as he led the small group through the foundation's facilities. He shared his own experiences, his voice filled with passion as he explained the impact the program had on both mentors and mentees. As the foundation's programs expanded, George found himself taking on more responsibilities. His journey from prejudiced store clerk to dedicated volunteer had given him a unique perspective that proved invaluable. Sarah recognized his growth and began to rely on him more and more. George, we're planning a new event to reach out to local businesses, Sarah explained during a meeting. I think you'd be perfect to lead this initiative. Your experience in retail and your personal growth story could really resonate with them. George felt a mix of nervousness and excitement at the prospect. Are you sure, Sarah? It's a big responsibility. Sarah smiled warmly. I'm positive. You've come so far, George. Your dedication and understanding are exactly what we need. With Sarah's encouragement, George threw himself into organizing the event. He reached out to local business owners, sharing his story and the foundation's mission. Many were moved by his honesty and eager to get involved. As the foundation grew, so did George's role within it. He found himself mentoring new volunteers, sharing the lessons he had learned on his own journey. His patient guidance and openness about his past mistakes helped others confront their own biases and grow. As the weeks turned into months, George's transformation continued to ripple through the department store. His colleagues noticed a marked change in his demeanor, and customers began to seek him out for assistance. One busy Saturday afternoon, an elderly woman approached George with a confused look on her face. "Excuse me, young man," she said hesitantly. "I'm looking for a gift for my grandson, but I don't know the first thing about these newfangled gadgets." George smiled warmly. "No worries, ma'am. I'd be happy to help you find the perfect gift. Can you tell me a bit about your grandson?" As the woman described her tech-savvy grandchild, George listened attentively. He guided her through the electronics section, explaining each item in simple terms she could understand. By the end of their interaction, the woman left with a tablet and a big smile on her face. "Thank you so much, George," she said, reading his name tag. "You've been so patient and kind. I'll be sure to tell all my friends about the wonderful service here." Word of George's helpfulness spread quickly. Customers began to request him by name, and his co-workers started coming to him for advice on handling difficult situations. Mina, a new employee, approached George one day during a lull in customer traffic. "George, I've been watching how you interact with customers," she said. "You're so good at making everyone feel welcome. Do you have any tips?" George's eyes lit up. "The most important thing is to listen," he explained. "Everyone has a story. And if you take the time to hear it, you can usually find a way to help. As George shared his insights, other colleagues gathered around, eager to learn from his experience. The impromptu training session became a regular occurrence, with George happily sharing what he had learned on his journey. The store's atmosphere began to change. Customers who had once felt uncomfortable or unwelcome now lingered, browsing the aisles with ease. The sound of laughter and friendly chatter filled the air, replacing the tense silence that had once prevailed. Mr. Davis, the store owner, couldn't help but notice the positive shift. Sales were steadily increasing, and customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive. He called George into his office one afternoon to discuss the changes. "George," Mr. Davis began, a proud smile on his face, "I want to commend you on the remarkable turnaround you've made. Your growth has not only impacted you personally, but has also transformed our entire store." George felt a warmth spread through his chest at the praise. "Thank you, sir," he replied humbly. "I'm just grateful for the chance to make things right." Martha sat in her office, scrolling through the latest reports from the department store. The numbers were impressive, showing a steady increase in sales and customer satisfaction. But it wasn't just the financial success that caught her attention. It was the stories, the countless positive reviews and heartfelt testimonials from customers who felt truly valued and respected. A smile played on her lips as she thought about how far the store had come. The transformation was remarkable, and she felt a sense of pride in having played a part in it. Martha leaned back in her chair, her mind made up. She picked up her phone and dialed Mr. Davis's number. When he answered, she said, "Mr. Davis, I've been reviewing the store's performance and I'm impressed. I'd like to discuss increasing my investment." Mr. Davis's voice was filled with excitement as he responded, "That's wonderful news, Martha. Your support has been invaluable. When would you like to meet to discuss the details?" They set up a meeting for the following week. As Martha hung up, her thoughts turned to the foundation where George had volunteered. She realized that the positive changes shouldn't stop at the store. There was so much more that could be done. Martha reached out to the foundation's director, proposing a collaboration. She offered to use her resources and connections to help expand their programs and reach more people in need. The director was thrilled by the offer, and they quickly began brainstorming ideas. Over the next few weeks, Martha became a regular presence at the foundation. She worked closely with the staff, including George, to develop new initiatives. Her tech expertise proved invaluable as they set up computer literacy classes for underprivileged youth and job training programs for adults. As she watched the foundation's impact grow, Martha felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that had started with a painful incident at the store had led to something truly beautiful. She saw hope in the eyes of the people they were helping, and it reinforced her belief in the power of second chances and community support. George stood at the entrance of the store, his eyes scanning the bustling aisles. A nervous young man approached him, fidgeting with his newly pinned name tag. "You must be Tyler," George said warmly, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team." Tyler shook George's hand, his anxiety evident in his tight grip. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. I'm excited to start, but also a bit nervous." George's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Please call me George, and don't worry, we all start somewhere. Come on, let me show you around." As they walked through the store, George pointed out various sections and explained the layout. He paused near the electronics department, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "You know, Tyler, this job isn't just about selling products, it's about people." Tyler looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" George took a deep breath and shared his story, the incident with Martha, his biases, and the journey of change he'd undergone. Tyler listened intently, his eyes widening as George spoke. "Wow," Tyler said when George finished. That's quite a story. I'm glad you shared it with me." George nodded. "I tell you this because it's important to understand the impact we can have on people's lives. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves respect and kindness, regardless of how they look or where they come from." As they continued the tour, George demonstrated his approach with customers. He greeted each person with a genuine smile, listened attentively to their needs, and offered help without judgment. Tyler watched closely, absorbing every interaction. Later, as Tyler began to assist customers on his own, George noticed a marked difference in the young man's demeanor. Tyler's initial nervousness had given way to a calm, friendly presence. He approached each customer with an open mind and a willingness to help. During a quiet moment, Tyler approached George. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, "about treating everyone with respect. I want you to know, I really took it to heart." George felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm glad to hear that, Tyler. It's the most important lesson I can teach you." Tyler nodded earnestly. "I promise to do my best to carry on that attitude. I want to make sure everyone feels welcome here, just like you do." The Foundation's annual gala was in full swing. The community center's main hall transformed into a sparkling wonderland. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the diverse crowd gathered below. The air buzzed with excitement and laughter as people from all walks of life mingled, united by their shared commitment to making the world a better place. At the center of it all stood Martha, radiant in a flowing emerald gown. She moved through the crowd with grace, stopping to chat with volunteers and donors alike. Her eyes sparkled as she listened to stories of lives changed and bridges built. George, looking dapper in a crisp suit, hovered near the refreshment table. He still felt a bit out of place at these events, but the warmth of the people around him was slowly melting away his discomfort. He watched Martha work the room, marveling at how far they'd both come since that fateful day in the store. As the evening progressed, the Foundation's director, Ms. Johnson, stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent as she tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "Tonight, we're here to celebrate two very special individuals who have made an incredible impact on our community." Ms. Johnson went on to praise Martha's unwavering support and vision. Then, she turned her attention to George. "And now, I'd like to present a special award to someone who has shown us the true meaning of growth and redemption." George's heart began to race as he realized what was happening. He felt a gentle push from behind and turned to see Martha smiling encouragingly at him. With shaky legs, he made his way to the stage. Ms. Johnson held up a beautiful crystal plaque. "George Thompson, for your dedication to promoting equality and your tireless efforts in our community, we present you with the Foundation's Beacon of Change Award." As George accepted the award, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. He looked out at the sea of faces he once might have judged, but now saw as friends and allies. His gaze met Martha's, and he saw her own eyes glistening with pride. George and Martha found a quiet corner of the bustling gala, each holding a glass of sparkling cider. They settled into plush chairs, the weight of the evening's emotions still hanging in the air. "I never thought we'd end up here," George said, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned the crystal award over in his hands, still marveling at its significance. Martha smiled warmly. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" She reached out and gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "You've come so far, George. I'm really proud of you." George's eyes misted over. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha. Your forgiveness, it changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the joyful crowd around them. Then Martha leaned forward, her expression turning thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about the store," she began. George perked up, curious. "Oh? What if we expanded our diversity training program? Make it a regular thing, not just for new hires," Martha suggested. "We could bring in speakers from the Foundation, maybe even set up mentorship opportunities." George nodded enthusiastically. "That's a great idea. And what if we also started a scholarship program for kids from underprivileged backgrounds? Help them get into tech or business schools?" Martha's eyes lit up. "I love it. We could tie it in with the Foundation's youth programs." As they bounced ideas back and forth, their excitement grew. They talked about community outreach events, partnerships with local schools, and ways to make the store a true hub of inclusivity. "You know," George said, his voice softening, "a year ago, I never would have imagined having this conversation. With you, of all people." Martha smiled, her eyes twinkling. Life has a way of bringing the right people together, even in the most unexpected ways. They clinked their glasses together, a toast to their unlikely friendship and the bright future they were building together. As they continued to chat, their bond grew stronger, reinforced by their shared vision of a more understanding and inclusive world. As the sun peeked through the store's large windows, George stood behind the counter, a warm smile on his face. A young woman approached, looking a bit lost among the rows of electronics. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" George asked, his voice gentle and welcoming. The woman looked relieved. "Yes, please, I'm looking for a tablet for my grandmother. She wants to video chat with us, but she's not very tech-savvy." George nodded understandingly. "No worries, we have some great options that are perfect for beginners. Let me show you." As he guided the customer through the store, explaining features in simple terms and offering patient demonstrations, Martha watched from near the entrance. She couldn't help but smile, remembering how far George had come. The store buzzed with positive energy. Employees chatted easily with customers of all backgrounds, and colorful posters advertising community events and educational programs lined the walls. The transformation was palpable. George helped the young woman choose a user-friendly tablet and even offered to set up a free training session for her grandmother. The customer left with a big smile, thanking George profusely for his kindness and patience. As he returned to the counter, George noticed Martha. His face lit up and he waved her over. "Martha, I didn't know you were coming by today," he said warmly. She approached, beaming with pride. "I wanted to see how things were going, and I have to say, I'm impressed." George's eyes crinkled with genuine happiness. "It's all thanks to you, you know. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one." Martha shook her head. "You did the hard work, George. You were willing to learn and change. That's what matters." They looked around the bustling store, taking in the diverse faces of customers and staff alike, all interacting with respect and kindness. "We really did it, didn't we?" George said softly. "We made a difference." Martha nodded, her eyes shining. "We did. And we'll keep making a difference, one person at a time." As they stood there, watching the harmonious scene before them, it was clear that the changes they had implemented would have a lasting impact on the community. Their journey proved that with compassion, education, and a willingness to change, even the most hardened hearts could be redeemed. If you enjoyed the story of George and Martha, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.